Welcome to the NASA Administrator, Jim Bridenstine.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Time keeps on slipping into the future.
Test. A little Steve Miller on-ramp there, huh? That's fantastic. Thank you for that theme music, I should say. Well, it's great to be here in Steamboat. I can tell you, about 3 weeks ago, my family and we came on vacation up here to Estes Park, spent a couple of days at the Rocky Mountain National Park, and of course, so being back again within 3 weeks, it's great. On the way in last night, we actually drove again through Rocky Mountain National Park, and we had a couple of traffic jams because of mule deer and moose, but it was beautiful the entire way. We loved every minute of it, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. As you are probably aware, we have been celebrating 50 years of the Apollo 11 moon landing. And yes, and me being here is another extension of that celebration. We will be celebrating these events all year long because this was an important moment in American history. But before we had Apollo 11, we had Apollo 6. And a lot of people say, well, what is Apollo 6 and why does that matter? Apollo 6 was in April of 1968. April of 1968. It was an uncrewed test of the Saturn V rocket. The intent of the test was we wanted to find out if the command module and the service module would work. We wanted to find out if we could accelerate it fast enough to test the heat shield when it returned into Earth orbit. But this mission was uncrewed. And let me tell you, when we launched the Saturn V, it began to do what we call at NASA pogo. It started going rapidly vibrating. It vibrated so hard that parts of the rocket in April of 1968, parts of the rocket fell off on launch. It vibrated so hard that the second stage of the rocket had 2 of its engines not work. Second stage had 5 engines. 2 of them didn't even work because it vibrated so much, the electrical wiring and the fuel hoses and everything else disconnected, created all kinds of problems. It got to Earth orbit. When it got to Earth orbit, that single rocket engine on the command and service module, that device that was going to be launched all the way to the moon, that command and service module had a single engine. That single engine to go to the moon has to be fired over and over and over again. Once for a trans-lunar injection, once to inject in lunar orbit, then to circularize the orbit around the moon, and then ultimately to come home. And that single engine on Apollo 6 did not reignite even once, let alone dozens of times. It could not achieve the velocity necessary to test the heat shield to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Apollo 6, friends, was a failure. NASA did not declare it as such, but it was indeed a failure. This was Apollo 6, April of 1968. When it came back, there was intelligence reporting that came in, and that intelligence reporting was very clear. The Soviet Union was going to be in orbit around the moon by the end of 1968. April of 1968, our systems and subsystems failed. Our tests failed. The intelligence reporting said by the end of the year, the Soviet Union will be in orbit around the moon. And so NASA had to make decisions. What are we going to do to get in front? Remember, we had already lost when it came to launching a satellite into orbit. Sputnik beat us. In fact, we weren't even trying when they launched Sputnik, which, by the way, was a mistake. And then after Sputnik, certainly they were the first to orbit a person around the Earth, Yuri Gagarin. So we were behind and we were trying to catch up. John F. Kennedy gave us a vision, a far enough vision where we could actually skip ahead, where we could leap ahead of our greatest competitor at the time, the Soviet Union. And here in April of 1968, we had failure. And of course, the Soviet Union was moving ahead fast, and by the end of the year, they're going to be around the moon. So NASA made a decision. We too are going to go around the moon by the end of the year. Remember, we had never been at this point farther than 800 miles above the Earth's surface, and now we're going to go 240,000 miles all the way to the moon by the end of the year. And the mission that we had just done was a complete failure. The only way to achieve this was to drop the lunar lander. The lunar lander, friends, was behind schedule. If we wanted to wait for the lunar lander, we were not going to beat the Soviet Union into orbit around the moon. So we said, okay, we're going to drop the lunar lander. We're going to go straight to the moon. What does that mean when you drop the lunar lander? That means that one engine is all you have. There is no lifeboat. Many people in this room are familiar with Apollo 13 and how they came home. They came home by using that lunar lander. Well, now they weren't going to have it for Apollo 8. They were going to go all the way to the moon on this single engine. But NASA was willing to take the risk. And of course, at the end of the day, they launched on Apollo 8. This is the other amazing thing. You think back in American history. In order to achieve this by the end of the year, the Earth-Moon alignment would place our astronauts in orbit around the moon on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Talk about a risk. If this is a failure, with our astronauts stranded in orbit around the moon, it would wreck Christmas. Not just for the United States of America, but for the whole world. And don't think for 1 second that that was not a political calculation. And yet we still made a decision that we were going to do it. We had never orbited the moon with humans before. And in December of 1968, Jim Lovell, Frank Borman, Bill Anders launched to the moon. And yes, it was eye-opening, and it wasn't without its problems. They had illness and all kinds of other challenges on board that mission. But also, when they were at the moon, they decided, and I'm not checking my messages here, I'm going to read to you what they read when they were in orbit around the moon on Christmas Eve, 1968. Christmas Eve, 1968, they broadcast from the moon, in orbit around the moon. This was the first time in human history anybody who had seen an Earthrise above the lunar surface. For the first time, they saw in their window the entirety of humanity. There wasn't a single person alive that they couldn't see out their window. It was all right there, the entire Earth rising above the moon. On Christmas Eve, they broadcast. NASA didn't tell them what to say. NASA just said, say something profound, because the entire world is going to be watching. The entire world was, in fact, watching on that evening. Remember, Christmas Eve. 1 out of every 4 people on the planet either heard or saw that broadcast on Christmas Eve during Apollo 8. Jim Lovell, Frank Borman, Bill Anders, they had this to say. And they said, we have a message for all the people in the world. It wasn't for the United States of America. This was a message for all the people of the world on Christmas Eve. And they began to read, one after another, taking turns. This was the message they wanted the world to hear. Are you ready for it? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called these seas. And God saw that it was good. And when they signed off, they said to everybody on the earth, Merry Christmas. That was their message on Christmas Eve. And you have to, yes. And you have to remember what was going on in the world at that time. You know, when you were living behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union, it was illegal to say such things. NASA had this very important moment in time where they could reach behind the Iron Curtain and communicate to tens of millions of people, and these three astronauts could have said anything they wanted, and what they wanted to share is something that is critically important in all of humanity, and that is where we come from. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, interestingly, Apollo 8 was an amazing success. And of course, we ended up being the first to orbit the Earth. But that wasn't the end. And of course, what we just got done celebrating, July 20th, was the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. And of course, we just heard the one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. There's another story embedded in there that doesn't get told enough. A story of another one of our astronauts who wanted to take a moment and share his experience with the entire world. And that, of course, was Buzz Aldrin. And a lot of people don't know what Buzz Aldrin did on the moon. But in those first hours on the surface of the moon, Buzz Aldrin, in fact, took communion. And what he said to the world was, Houston, this is Eagle. This is the lunar module pilot speaking. In other words, Buzz Aldrin. I would like to request a few moments of silence. I would like to invite each person listening. And by the way, 1 out of 4 people heard the Apollo 8 broadcast. Everybody heard this one. He was on the moon. They were getting ready to get out of their vehicle. And he said, I would like to invite each person listening in, wherever and whomever he may be, to contemplate for a moment the events of the past few hours, and to invite each person listening, wherever and whomever he may be, to contemplate the events of the past few hours and to give thanks in his own individual way. Then quietly, Buzz Aldrin read these words. John 15:5. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit, for you can do nothing without me. And then he took communion on the surface of the moon, another world, for the first time in human history. Everybody knows who the Everybody knows who the first person was to take a step on the moon. Not a lot of people know who the first person was to take communion on another world. But that wasn't the end. When he decided, when they were coming home, they made another broadcast. And Buzz Aldrin decided to key the mic this time and broadcast to the entire world what he was thinking. He read Psalm 8, 3 through 4. Quote from, of course, Scripture, but Buzz Aldrin sang it at the time. They were on their way home from the moon, and he said these words. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained. What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him? These messages are important for a very key reason. We have to remember what was happening in the world at the time. We had this thing called the Iron Curtain, and people were not allowed to hear these words, let alone participate in their own religious faith. And the United States of America had a very different philosophy. We're not going to tell you what to say. We're not going to tell you how to say it. You are free people, and we need to communicate to the whole world that we are indeed a free people. And of course, that freedom is enshrined in the First Amendment. And that First Amendment is very clear. We have the freedom in this country to practice our faith. And that is unique in the history of humankind. And of course, our astronauts, in the early days of our astronaut program, were very keen on that. And when we think about the element of power here that is important, these communications behind the Iron Curtain, that kind of reach, we talk about elements of national power. People say, well, NASA, that's not a military operation. You're absolutely right. It is not a military operation. NASA is an element of national power that has other ways of changing the perceptions of people all around the world towards the United States of America. The elements of national power, for those in the military, I'm sure there are people here, we talk about it in terms of what we call DIME, diplomatic power, information power, military power, which is what people are most familiar with, and then economic power. Each one of those are elements of national power, and the parts of the U.S. government that we all know exist, and of course many of us work very hard to make sure that those are functioning properly for the American taxpayer. Those elements of national power are all very meaningful. The diplomatic power that is NASA, think about this. In those days, NASA went alone. Today, the International Space Station is operated by 15 different countries. We've had astronauts from dozens of different countries. We've had experiments on the International Space Station from 103 different countries. NASA is a tool of diplomatic power. And of course now, under President Trump, we have a new direction to go to the moon. And I can tell you all of our international partners are very keen on going to the moon. Why? Because they've never been there, but the United States of America has. They want to go. They want to be with us. NASA is that tool of diplomatic power. President Trump gave us very clear guidance in Space Policy Directive 1. He said we're going to go back to the moon, this time sustainably. In other words, we're going to stay for long periods of time. He said we're going to go with commercial partners, which drives down costs and increases access to space and the surface of the moon. We're going to go with international partners, again, making it more sustainable for the long term. We're going to utilize, this is new and important, for the first time in human history, we are going to utilize the resources of another world to learn how to live and work for long periods of time on another world. What does that mean? What resources exist on the moon? Hundreds of millions of tons of water ice on the south pole of the moon. Hundreds of millions of tons of water. That water ice is air to breathe, oxygen. It's rocket fuel. Hydrogen and oxygen is the same rocket fuel that powered the space shuttles. It's the same rocket fuel that will power the Space Launch System, the biggest, most powerful rocket ever built. It's the same rocket fuel that powered the Saturn rockets that took Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon. Hydrogen and oxygen is available in hundreds of millions of tons on the south pole of the moon in the form of water ice. And friends, we made that discovery just in 2008 and in 2009 with scientific experiments led by not just NASA, but some of our international partners as well. Here's what that means. That means that we can learn how to live and work on the moon and then go to Mars. That's the last piece of Space Policy Directive 1, signed by the President. The President has been very clear with me. The moon is a waypoint. The destination is Mars. And the President says every time he gives a speech these days, we will put an American flag on Mars. I had a question the other day. Somebody asked me, well, why do we need to put an American flag on Mars? I'll tell you why. Because where the American flag is, there is freedom. That's why we put an American flag on Mars. So this is all in the President's very first space policy directive. Of course, since then, he has given a lot of space policy directives. One of them that I'm sure most people in the room are familiar with is that thing called the Space Force. I will tell you, I have been an advocate of it since I was in the House of Representatives. I will also tell you that when I was in the House, we voted on it. And it got 344 votes in a bipartisan way. It is long overdue. We need to get it passed, and I think under this President's leadership, it will in fact get passed, and I'm happy to talk about that in a few minutes. But know this, We talk about these elements of national power: diplomatic, information. When we talk about Apollo 8 and Apollo 11 and how it shaped the world towards the favor of the United States of America, that is information power. The other day, in fact, November of last year, we landed a small lander on Mars. It was called InSight. There's only one country in the history of the world that has ever landed on another planet, namely Mars, softly. And that only country is the United States of America. We have now done it 8 times, and when we landed InSight, we landed, in fact, with our international partners. Here's the important point. When we landed InSight on Mars, it was on the cover of every newspaper worldwide, including a newspaper, and I read this online. I don't get a subscription to this, just so you know. But there was a newspaper in Tehran, and that newspaper subtitled was "The Hardline Newspaper of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps." I am telling you, they don't write very many good things about the United States of America. But I will also tell you that when we landed InSight on Mars, they had a great article in there. And it was about this magnificent achievement. And the last paragraph talks specifically about all of our international partners that were with us: France, Germany, Poland, Spain. That is information power. It has the ability to transform the perceptions of young people all over the world towards the United States of America. That is an element of national power that NASA uniquely brings to bear. And by the way, we do it all the time. Shortly after we landed InSight on Mars, we had another mission around Christmas. In fact, it was a little bit before New Year's. We entered orbit around an asteroid in deep space called Bennu, with a mission called OSIRIS-REx. OSIRIS-REx is a robot that is characterizing Bennu, an asteroid in deep space, and pretty soon it will go down and it will grab a piece of Bennu and bring it back to the Earth for the first time in human history, doing an intentional asteroid mission, bringing parts of an asteroid back to Earth for scientific study. And of course, just a few days after that, we took the New Horizons probe. Many of you in this room have seen the beautiful images of Pluto that came out in 2015 from NASA's New Horizons probe. Well, that probe didn't end there. It kept going past Pluto. It went into what we call the Kuiper Belt, which is a long ways past Pluto. The probe got to be 4 billion miles from Earth, and it took pictures of an asteroid called Ultima Thule, which is what we call a binary contact, 2 asteroids that have somehow joined themselves in deep space, giving gravity of the 2 objects. And now we're still getting science back from the Kuiper Belt with this New Horizons mission. Interestingly, it wasn't too long after that China landed a small lander on the far side of the moon. And I get called into the House of Representatives and into the Senate. How did we fall so far behind? They land. My point exactly, right? They landed something like this on the far, like the size of this podium, on the far side of the moon. And everybody's like, well, how did we fall so far? We didn't, friends. We landed on the far side, too, of Mars. And so just know this. We are way ahead. We are getting further ahead. The president has given us very clear direction, and he hasn't just made it rhetoric. He's backing it up with his budget requests that are now getting, in fact, very strong bipartisan support. I will tell you, the reason I love this job is because everybody loves NASA. We do amazing things, and it is transforming the world. It is transforming our understanding of our solar system, our galaxy, and in fact, our universe. But again, you guys probably saw just a few weeks, if not a few months after that, for the first time, we had the Crew Dragon, which was a SpaceX vehicle. You know, we're going to the International Space Station now commercially. We're no longer going to be government purchased, owned, and operated. We're buying services from commercial operators, which is going to drive down costs and increase access. I'll be happy to talk about that in a little bit. But we're going to take advantage of commercial capabilities. But the Crew Dragon has now attached to the International Space Station with an uncrewed crew vehicle. And in the coming year, we will be launching, and this is important, we will be launching again. And I don't know if you heard the President say it in his State of the Union, but we will be launching American astronauts on American rockets from American soil for the first time since the retirement of the space shuttles back in 2011. So these are very exciting times. There's a lot of missions that NASA has underway. But we think about those elements of national power, diplomatic power, information power. That's where NASA plays. Then there's military power. You know, when it comes to technology, there's some transfer back and forth for sure. Sometimes NASA technology has military applications. A lot of times military technology has NASA applications. You know, when we launched our first astronauts, they were going on ICBMs, if you can imagine that. Launching astronauts on ICBM rockets. That's how we first got humans into space. Alan Shepard on a Redstone rocket. So these are technologies that go back and forth. So we don't play in that military arena, but certainly we have applications there that go back and forth. And then in the economic arena, and this is, I think, an important point, we are commercializing as much as we can, as rapidly as we can. So it used to be NASA would purchase, own, and operate all of the hardware. That is not the case anymore. We are buying services. Right now we have commercial resupply to the International Space Station, where we are buying services to get our cargo and equipment to the International Space Station. Within the year, we will have commercial crew, where we're buying services to get our astronauts to the International Space Station. We now have a program to commercialize low Earth orbit with a number of lines of initiative. One would be industrialized biomedicine, another would be advanced materials. We're using the International Space Station to create the demand for these activities in a microgravity environment, namely in low Earth orbit. Why? Because we want to see a day where we have dozens of human-tended space stations in orbit around the Earth that NASA does not own and operate, for these activities that will be transformative for the human condition on Earth. That's our goal. And we want to do it commercially, where we have numerous customers, I should say, where NASA wants to be one customer of many customers, and we want numerous providers that are competing against each other on cost and innovation to drive down cost and increase access. We want to do it in low Earth orbit with space stations and launch, but we also want to do it at the moon. And the President has been very clear in Space Policy Directive 1, we're going to go to the moon with commercial partners, with international partners. We're going to drive down those costs, and we're going to be able to sustain. In other words, when we go to the moon, we're going to stay. We're going to utilize the resources of the moon, and we're going to take all of that capability onto Mars. Now, I'm going to show you a video here. This is about the architecture that we're putting together. It's called We Are Going. And then after we watch the video, I'll talk for a little bit more, and then we'll do some Q&A.
50 years ago, we pioneered a path to the moon. The trail we blazed cut through the fictions of science and showed us all what was possible.
It's very pretty out here.
Today, our calling to explore is even greater. To go farther, we must be able to sustain missions of greater distance and duration. We must use the resources we find at our destinations. We must overcome radiation, isolation, gravity, and extreme environments like never before. These are the challenges we face to push the bounds of humanity. We're going to the moon to stay by 2024, and this is how.
This all starts with the ability to get larger, heavier payloads off planet and beyond Earth's gravity.
For this, we designed an entirely new rocket.
The Space Launch System. SLS will be the most powerful rocket ever developed.
And with components in production
and more in testing,
this system is capable of being the catalyst for deep space missions.
We need a capsule
that can support humans from launch
through deep space and return safely back to Earth.
For this, we've built Orion.
This is NASA's next-generation human space capsule.
Using data from lunar orbiters that continue to reveal the moon's hazards and resources,
we're currently developing an entirely new approach to landing and operating on the moon.
Using our commercial partners to deliver science instruments and robotics to the surface, we are paving the way for human missions in 2024.
Our charge is to go quickly and to stay, to press our collective efforts forward with a fervor that will see us return to the moon in a manner that is wholly different than 50 years ago.
We want lunar landers that are reusable.
That can land anywhere on the lunar surface.
The simplest way to do so is to give them a platform in orbit around the moon from which to transition.
An orbiting platform to host deep space experiments and be a waypoint for human capsules. We call this lunar outpost Gateway.
The beauty of the Gateway is that it can be moved between orbits.
It will balance between the Earth and Moon's gravity,
in a position that is ideal for launching even deeper space missions.
In 2009, we learned that the moon contains millions of tons of water ice.
This ice can be extracted and purified for water. It can be separated in oxygen for breathing or hydrogen for rocket fuel.
The moon is quite uniquely suited
to prepare us and propel us to Mars and beyond.
This is what we are building.
This is what we're training for.
This we can replicate throughout the solar system.
This is the next chapter of human space exploration.
Humans are the most fragile element of this entire endeavor, and yet we go for humanity. We go to the moon and on to Mars to seek knowledge and understanding and to share it with all. We go knowing our efforts will create opportunities that cannot be foreseen. We go because we are destined to explore and see it with our own eyes. We turn towards the moon now, not as a conclusion, but as preparation, as a checkpoint toward all that lies beyond. Our greatest adventures remain ahead of us. We are going.
We're going.
We are going.
We are going. We're going.
You saw the Artemis logo there at the end. We're going to show another video here called the Artemis Generation, and that will explain more about why we call it Artemis and how this time is going to be different than previous times. So with that, I'm free to answer any questions, and I know there's people here that have questions, but I've been told that we have a moderator here that's going to make sure that everybody stays in line.
Well, please have a seat.
You bet.
All right, before we get started, kind of wanted to chat with you. I know you need astronauts, and I am in no way qualified, but I have watched Apollo 13 like a dozen times. I mean, do you have any room for a journalist on your way to the moon and the Mars?
I will tell you, we need journalists. We are recruiting journalists. I'll tell you what we need, and maybe you can help with this. 1960s, we were successful in going to the moon. Why? Because the American people were behind it. And they are today as well, don't get me wrong. You look at the polling, this is a very popular kind of thing to do. But at the time, we had Walter Cronkite. And he was on the evening news every night talking about the space initiative of President Kennedy. He was very, very well informed on all these activities. So the answer is yes, we need journalists. We need people to cover this. And the other thing that's important, remember, we are now going to the International Space Station with commercial crew. In other words, there will be NASA astronauts on there for sure. But there will be seats available for people that are not NASA astronauts.
I was afraid you were going to stuff me in an overhead compartment or something, so well, I would have been grateful.
Just so you know, on a space capsule, everything is like an overhead compartment.
All right, so jokes aside, I think that we have had a wonderful conference. We've had some fantastic speakers, but I don't think I am speaking out of turn to say that we saved our absolute best for last. Ladies and gentlemen, one more round of applause for the man that's going to help us go back to the moon. You have mentioned history throughout your presentation, and I wanted to see if you could react to something. Shortly after Apollo 11 landed on the Sea of Tranquility, the Ramada Inn ran full-page advertisements in newspapers across the country, and they advertised this futuristic-looking lunar hotel, and they had the tagline, "Soon on the moon." That was half a century ago. And And so, like we saw in the video, we're going back to the moon. We're going back to the moon to stay. But my question is, what took us so long?
So it's a great question. So I'll tell you what NASA is really good at. We are really good at retiring technical risk. That's what we do very well. I'll tell you what NASA is not so good at. NASA is a political entity. And we have had visions in the past. You go back to the 1990s, and we had the vision for space exploration. Or actually, 1990s was the Space Exploration Initiative. And while it was a great vision to go to the moon and onto Mars, people in the administration were saying we need to fund it by taking the money from the International Space Station. Well, that creates a big political fight when you talk about the delegations from Texas and Florida and Alabama, and it ended up killing the program because it was a political miscalculation. And then in the 2000s, we had President George W. Bush initiated the vision for space exploration, and that was, again, to go to the moon and then on to Mars. And we created the Constellation program, invested billions of dollars. But again, this time, they were funding it by cannibalizing the Science Mission Directorate of NASA, which created a partisan fight that ultimately was not sustainable. And as soon as a new administration came in, that whole program got canceled immediately. And the space shuttles were already being programmed to be retired, and that stayed on track. And so now we've been 8 years without a human spaceflight capability. And I'll tell you, that is not acceptable to President Trump. And he has looked at me and he's put it in his State of the Union. We need to launch American astronauts on American rockets from American soil. And so, yes, we have had these challenges. The other thing that's important to note, if you look at our historical budgets, we can land on the moon in the year 2028. And so I put that in the budget request, and the president and the vice president. So one thing the president did is he created the National Space Council. He put the vice president as chairman of it.
Yes.
We just had a National Space Council meeting this week, this most recent week. And the vice president Pence, I will tell you, he is a true believer in space exploration and going farther and doing more. And I will tell you that what we do next is important. They want to go to the moon. I said 2028 if our current budgets. They said, no, that's not good enough. And they gave us additional money to accelerate the path. Why? Here's why. We have to retire the political risk. How do you retire political risk? You go faster. The longer these programs go, when you have Congresses change, administrations change, that's the risk.
So I want to drill down on that really quickly because it seems that the politics does get in the way of technology.
Absolutely.
If you're in DC, that's no surprise to you. But I wanted to ask specifically about this president. President Trump has been very gung-ho when it comes to going back to the moon. He was very excited about it in May, and then in June, he tweeted out that NASA should not be talking about going to the moon. We did that 50 years ago. So where were you when you saw that tweet, and what was your reaction? And is he on board for Moon first, Mars second?
So number one, yes, he is absolutely on board with Moon to Mars. I think he got frustrated because he hears us talking so much about the moon. And if President Trump is great at anything, it is messaging. And he knows that 50 years ago, we in fact went to the moon. And that, we have to remember, what is his agenda? What is the goal? The goal is an American flag on Mars. And so President Trump sent that tweet to signal to everybody at NASA, quit talking about the moon, talk about Mars. I called the president after that tweet just to clarify. And he said yes. He said, we are going to the moon to get to Mars. He understands that. But he said, I want you talking about Mars. Yes, sir, we'll talk about Mars.
And returning to the political question here, I mean, we saw President Obama promise that he was going to reestablish the National Space Council, but he was not able to follow up in his 8 years.
Yeah.
What has the reestablishment of that council meant? And you touched on it briefly, but what kind of leadership has the vice president shown in that area in particular? Tell us more about the council and why it's important.
So the National Space Council has a purpose, and the purpose is, how does the United States of America remain the preeminent spacefaring nation? By the way, we are preeminent. We will remain preeminent. The vice president has been picked by the president to chair basically a council that makes sure that that happens. A lot of people don't realize NASA is a small piece of the American space portfolio. All the different, you look at the Secretary of Commerce, well, they have NOAA and the National Weather Service. So when you think about our weather satellites, when we think about how we do remote sensing from space, that's all licensed, and now that remote sensing is being done commercially. That's all licensed by the Commerce Department. When we think about launching commercially into space, DirecTV, Dish Network, XM radio, internet broadband from space, all of those commercial activities in space are launched, they're licensed, those launches and re-entries are licensed by the FAA. So now you've got the Department of Transportation, you've got the Department of Commerce. Of course, everybody is familiar with how involved the Department of Defense is in space. NASA's involved in space. The the Director of National Intelligence is involved in space. So we have all of these different elements. And by the way, even agriculture now depends on space because of technologies that NASA has developed that are helping us grow more food than ever before and create very specific irrigation plans to increase crop yields while reducing water usage. Anyway, so all of these different elements of the federal government are involved in space in a very significant way. The question is, how do we make sure that they're coordinated? And the vice president has put all of us on this council. I should say the president put all of us on this council. We meet about once a quarter, and we talk about these issues. Now, from that, we've had Space Policy Directive 1, which is this return to the moon that you just saw. We've had Space Policy Directive 2, which is a transformation of our regulatory environment in space. Everybody here is aware of President Trump's focus on the regulatory environment. We have transformed it in a way that benefits the American space industry. That was Space Policy Directive 2. Space Policy Directive 3 was about space situation awareness, space traffic management, dealing with the debris fields. Space Policy Directive 4 was about the U.S. Space Force. And so, look, this has been the most aggressive administration in my lifetime towards American preeminence in space, and that's been a very positive thing for our country.
You touched on it briefly in your remarks when you were talking about the Chinese government's ability to land that satellite on the dark side of the moon. One of the things that really propelled the United States was the rivalry with the USSR during the space race. Do you see the Chinese as a competitor, as a worthy rival in this area?
When it comes to space exploration, I mean, they're not really on the same level. I will tell you one of the things that's important about space is how easy it is to damage it. And space, China has called space the American Achilles heel. So yes, they are absolutely a rival. It is a problem for our country. They have been very aggressive in a whole host of space activities that are classified. And so yes, we have to know that they are there and doing nefarious things, and we have to be prepared for that. But some of the technologies would include, and we've seen it, direct ascent anti-satellite missiles. 2007, they launched a satellite, created an orbital debris field that the United States of America uniquely has the capability to track all of those pieces of orbital debris. And now China calls the United States of America and says, hey, we've got taikonauts in space. Can you help us with the debris mitigation plan? Well, you know, they created the problem. Now we have to provide the situational awareness for them so that their astronauts or taikonauts remain safe. So, but the answer is yes, they are a competitor. When it comes to space exploration, again, you know, we've landed on Mars 8 times in human history. Nobody else has done that. We're doing missions at Saturn and Jupiter and Pluto in the Kuiper Belt. We've got robots that are orbiting asteroids, bringing material home. We've got the International Space Station that's been in orbit around the Earth now for almost 20 years. Of course, we had the space shuttles. Now we've got commercial crew, commercial resupply. Look, nobody is close to the United States of America. We lead the world. We now go with international partners. It puts us in a great position diplomatically. But I will be very clear. China does not, their space program is operated by the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. That gives you some window into what they're doing in space, and they're not doing the science that NASA is doing.
I want to continue with a question, and I hope that you'll indulge me here. 12 men have walked on the lunar surface. All of them are Americans. There are 6 flags on the moon. All of them are American flags. We were the first to get there, and if you're right, we will be the first to go back.
We will be.
Does the United States own the moon? And if not, who does?
So we, even before we landed on the moon in 1967, we were signatories to what's called the Outer Space Treaty. And in there, that treaty is very clear, and we are signatories to it, and I support this. It is very clear that no nation can appropriate the moon for national sovereignty. We are signatories to that. We abide by it, and we expect others to abide by it. So no, we do not own the moon. I will also tell you that when I was in the House of Representatives, I was part of drafting a bill that clarified for the United States of America what that means. Because when you talk about the resources of the moon, we talk about the water ice, tremendously valuable on the south pole of the moon, but there are potentially other resources. So we think about platinum group metals, what we call rare earth metals. I don't know if you guys have seen recently, but China has said they're no longer going to sell America rare earth metals, which are critically important to a whole host of technologies for our country. The question is, what are those rare earth metals? Those are asteroid impacts from billions of years ago. Now, here's the thing. The Earth has a very active geology. We have an active hydrosphere. We have an active atmosphere. What that means is that those rare earth metals, first of all, they're not earth metals. They're asteroid impacts. Number two, they're not today where they were billions of years ago because of how the Earth has churned itself over the years. The moon is very different. We together, the Earth-Moon system, we fly through the same piece of space together all the time. So when we go through an asteroid field, so does the moon. The difference is the moon doesn't have an active geology. It doesn't have an active hydrosphere. It doesn't have an active atmosphere. Whatever impacted the moon billions of years ago is today exactly where it was billions of years ago. In other words, there could be trillions of dollars worth of platinum group metals on the moon that could change the balance of power here on Earth, depending on who can get access to it. Now, I'm not saying it's there. I don't know. But I will also tell you nobody else knows either. The United States of America ought to be the one that finds out.
Very good.
And
I wanted to...
real quick, though, when it comes to these, we put into law that while we cannot appropriate the moon for national sovereignty, and we all agree with that, that you can apply your labor and your investment to the extraction of resources, and you can own those resources as a private company.
Very good.
And that is true. That if you look at international waters and how we do oil drilling and those kind of things, those resources are available to, but we don't own the ocean, but we do own the resources that are extracted from the ocean. And so the moon has a very, I think, similar kind of possibility.
You have given a lot of encouraging news when it comes to the United States leading in space. I wanted to ask you, though, why is it that U.S. astronauts are riding Russian rockets into space? Is that an embarrassment? Who is to blame? And when will that be fixed?
Okay, so this is a great question, a very important question. Remember where we were in 1969 when we landed on the moon. It was a great power competition. We were competing, trying to demonstrate political, technological, economic prowess as a nation, and we were trying to demonstrate the United States was better than the Soviet Union. Now, after we landed on the moon 6 times with 12 humans, and by the way, I hear people say, did we really land on the moon? Well, which time are you talking about? Because we did it 6 times. And by the way, the people that would have had the most to gain from it being faked would have been the Russians, and they congratulated us. So guess what? It's very real. Just in case there's any doubters out there. And if you were Buzz Aldrin, you'd be punching people in the face, which he has done. So a couple of things on the where we were. Now, after we got that complete and we did those 6 missions, it was after that that the United States and the Soviet Union, we actually started partnering. In fact, the year of my birth, 1975, and I know you guys are the year of my birth, 1975, I'm 44 years old. we, for the first time, by the way, I was not alive when we landed on the moon in any of those missions, which we've got to change, we've got to fix for the next generation. But what's important to note is that after those landings, the Soviet Union wanted to partner with the United States. And in 1975, we partnered with them on the Apollo-Soyuz program. And then after that, with the space shuttle, we partnered with them on their space station called Mir. And even today, for 20 years, you've had Americans and Russians living and working in space together on the International Space Station for almost 20 years. That is an amazing channel of communication and diplomatic capability that only NASA has. And it makes sure that we don't have miscalculations, and it helps build trust. Now, it is absolutely true that we as a nation ought not be dependent on anybody for access to space. And it is true that when we decided to retire the space shuttles, there was a plan to make sure that we weren't dependent on space. That plan got canceled. And of course, when that plan got canceled, we have now been without human access to space for 8 years, and we have been partners with Russia. That relationship, as long as we're talking about space exploration, has remained strong. And we have all kinds, believe me, all kinds of terrestrial geopolitical challenges that are very significant, but somehow we've managed to keep space exploration separate from all of that. And as the NASA administrator, I think that's important, and I continue to keep that relationship.
I want to talk about private industry in space. We've touched on this briefly. You have said, if I'm not mistaken, that it's possible that perhaps one of these private companies could even go back to the moon before the United States does. Peter Thiel is very fond of saying something along the lines that we were promised flying cars, instead we got 140 characters. The idea being that our parents got the moon, and my generation got Facebook, which is not great. So do you think that this overall mission is going to spark new industry, and do you think that aside from the couple companies that are out there, that private industry has the capability to be the partner that NASA needs?
100% yes, and we're making it happen even right now today. When it comes to low Earth orbit, we are 100% committed to commercializing. In other words, we don't want to be the landlord anymore in low Earth orbit. We want to be a tenant. NASA will always be in space, but we believe that there is a robust commercial marketplace for activities in a microgravity environment. Medicine, pharmaceuticals, we call it industrialized biomedicine, advanced materials, things that you can create in a microgravity environment that you cannot create in a gravity well. And I can give you
such as 3D printed hearts,
yes.
That sort of thing. Can you explain why 3D printed human organs in space?
Yeah.
Why that's an advantage?
So we can use be clear, adult stem cells, and we can create from that human organs. But if you do it in a gravity well, they end up flat. Mm-hmm. When you do it in a microgravity environment, and so that you have to create a lattice structure to hold it. And of course that diminishes the quality of that capability. But in a microgravity environment in space, we can change that. We don't have to have that lattice structure, and those organs could be made available for you or others. It would transform human lives on Earth, and it would create a marketplace in Earth orbit for all of these activities. One thing that I just found so fascinating is retinal implants, people who have macular degeneration. We can create implants, and this isn't using adult stem cells, but we can create implants in a microgravity environment. We can layer materials in a way that you cannot do in a gravity well. And you can do that in a microgravity environment. And so we're now sending boxes, potentially, to the International Space Station that will bring back retinal implants so people who have macular degeneration will not lose their eyesight. Wow. And that could be transformative.
One of the, I think that there are some...
By the way, I want to be clear. We are experimenting with all of these things. We have not done that yet. We are, but these are just two examples of so many other things that we're experimenting with. And I think it's about a 3 to 7 year window where we have a market breakthrough that's going to create massive investments into these habitations in low Earth
This
orbit.
is fascinating. If there are any questions from the audience, I mean, there's a universe of things. If you could please write those down on note cards and pass them around. Oh, we'll do a microphone. Before we get there, I wanted to ask one quick question before we go to the audience. One of the very exciting firsts is that not only will we send man back to the moon, but we also send women for the first time for a moonwalk. But this will occur at a moment when there are some on the left who downplay the biological differences between men and women. And I was reading some of the remarks that Vice President Pence has made, and he seemed to address this when he said that NASA needed to be, quote, clear-eyed and account for those differences. What are those differences as they relate to space travel? And with liberal gender theory, increasingly being widespread in Washington, D.C., are there any internal tensions between that sentiment and some of the folks at NASA?
So I will be clear. NASA has very strong bipartisan support for our agenda and our initiatives, and I want to keep that. In fact, if we're going to achieve what we need to achieve for our country, we have to make sure NASA keeps that bipartisan support. It is also true that without question there are biological differences between men and women, and we have to take those into account when we talk about human spaceflight. The radiation environment of deep space affects men and women very differently. The microgravity environment of deep space affects men and women very. In fact, women in many cases, in this case, when you talk about cranial pressure that can result in the swelling of certain nerves, including the nerves in your eyes that changes people's vision. Women do a lot better than men because men just have a lot more problems with cranial pressure in a microgravity environment. There are in many cases, ways that women are going to be able to do things that men don't do as well when we talk about long duration stays in space. We ought to be able to take advantage of that. That's why when we go to the moon next time and on to Mars, we're going with a very diverse, highly qualified astronaut corps that includes women.
Very good. So I think that we have some questions now, and I'll try to enforce Sagar's 15-second rule best I can.
Well, I'm incredibly impressed with your knowledge. I have a two-part question, if I might. First part's maybe considered a little frivolous, but having watched Top Gun several times, I was curious to know what your handle was as a Navy pilot.
So my call sign was Brainstem. And then people would just call me STEM for short. And people were like, well, why do they call you Brainstem? And I like to tell people it's because I'm smart. But the reality is, and I know there's this camera rolling and this is all going to be made public, so I can't keep this charade going, but Bridenstine is a difficult name to say. I had a lieutenant commander when I first checked in my squadron. He couldn't ever get it right, so he just started calling me Brainstem, and it stuck. That's the story.
The second question.
Second part, with all of the planned exploration in space, I'm just curious to know if there's any consideration given to coordinating with SETI.
Well, certainly. So the SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence using, basically radar dishes and other ways of listening to electromagnetic radiation from deep space. I'll tell you what is fascinating, that NASA we have to reconsider some of what we do, and it's really amazing. We think about in the last 5 years. In fact, probably the last 5 years, we have now found thousands of planets around other stars. Thousands. I want to say it's like 9,000 at this point, but every day we're finding planets around other stars. For the first time, we now understand that first of all, there's 40 billion stars in our own galaxy, and there's a lot more planets than there are stars.
I don't want this to sound frivolous. I'm asking this question seriously. At this point, and this is a question that some of my colleagues have even asked the president, but at this point, knowing what you know now as the NASA administrator, and looking at the science, and then also asking the question from a philosophic background as well, is there anything that would make you preclude or be more convinced of the possibility of life elsewhere?
Great question. My goodness, we have another hour. So I'll just give you some examples. Spirit and Opportunity, 2 of the rovers that we landed on Mars. From those rovers, we have discovered significant things. Number one, the northern hemisphere of Mars was covered in an ocean. Mars used to have a very strong magnetosphere that protected it from the radiation of deep space, and Mars used to have a very thick atmosphere. That's from Spirit and Opportunity. Those missions were supposed to last 90 days. One lasted 10 years, the other 15 years. Congratulations, NASA, they do amazing work. Now we have on Mars the Curiosity Rover. Within the last year, we have discovered complex organic compounds on the surface of Mars. What does that mean? The building blocks for life exist on Mars. They don't exist on the moon at all, 0. But on Mars, they're all over. We have now seen that on Mars, the methane cycles of Mars are commensurate with the seasons of Mars. That doesn't guarantee that there's life on Mars, but the probability just went up. We have found in the last year liquid water that exists today, not that existed years ago, that exists today, liquid water 12 kilometers under the surface of Mars. What do we know about liquid water on Earth? Anywhere there's liquid water, there is life. Is that true on Mars? I don't know, but that liquid water is 12 kilometers under the surface where it would be protected from the radiation of deep space. So the probability of finding life on Mars is going up rapidly. And again, imagine this. Imagine if the first nation to find life on another world, which will in fact rewrite textbooks, history books, science books, imagine if that nation is not the United States of America. That would be a very disappointing day for our country. We've got to go find it. And when I talk about life, I'm talking about microbial life. We're not going to find bunny rabbits on Mars. Although if we did, I'd be for it. Don't get me wrong.
Well,
but I do think the probability of finding life is going up. We look at Europa, which is a moon of Jupiter. Think of a moon the size of our moon, except it's pure. It's all water. The entire world of Jupiter, which is the same size of Europa, the same size as our moon. The whole world is an ocean covered in an ice shell. And now with our missions to Jupiter, we're actually seeing plumes of liquid water being spewed out of that world. So the answer is I do believe that there is a probability we could find life on a world that's not our own, and it will be transformational for how we think of ourselves and the science that we want to do.
Well, I told you we saved the best for last. Well, thank you so much, sir.
Can I close do a closing statement? I know the question came up earlier, and this young lady over here decided to clap for it. You were asking about women in the astronaut corps and the differences in biology and how we account for that. That's an important issue that NASA has to get right. And of course, we haven't always been good at that, but we are fixing it. And I will tell you this. The vice president, who is the chairman of the National Space Council, and he is as focused on space as any vice president I think that has ever existed before, he has said very clearly that we will land on the moon within 5 years. And he said the next man and the first woman on the south pole of the moon will be Americans. He was the one that wrote the speech and made it very clear that we will have women walking on the moon. And I will tell you that's transformational for my life. I've got an 11-year-old daughter. I want her to see herself as having all of the opportunities I saw myself when I was growing up. This is why we are calling this program Artemis. We look at Greek mythology, we talk about the Apollo program. We love Apollo. It transformed the world. But we also know that in those days, all of our astronauts came from fighter pilot backgrounds, test pilot backgrounds, and there were no opportunities for women. Now when we go to the moon, we have this very diverse, highly qualified astronaut corps that includes women, and we are naming the program after the twin sister in Greek mythology, the twin sister of Apollo. Her name is Artemis. She happens to be the goddess of the moon. Now we're going to go to the moon sustainably with a very diverse, highly qualified astronaut corps that includes women under the name Artemis. And that's what this next video is all about.
Ladies and gentlemen, one more round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
50 years ago, we went to the moon. We called it Apollo.
What many people don't know
is that Apollo had a twin.
She was a woman named Artemis,
goddess of the moon.
We are returning to the moon.
as a new generation of explorers.
This time to stay.
And to prepare to achieve humanity's next giant leap of sending the first human missions to Mars.
We believe our course will redefine what is possible.
That we would discover life-saving,
earth-changing science.
And that the challenges ahead will inspire generations.
This is our manifest.
For all who wondered if we could return.
For all who dreamed of pressing beyond.
This is your calling.
We go for all of America.
We go.
We go as the Artemis generation.
We go.
Okay, finally, thank you. I just want to say in closing, this is important. I am the first NASA administrator that was not alive when somebody walked on another world. I am the first one. That is a failure. We have to get this fixed. I want to make sure that there is not another generation. That's why we call it the Artemis generation. We need to claim it. We need to take it back. We need to make sure there is not another generation where there is a NASA administrator who is never had an opportunity to see somebody else walk on another world. This is the Artemis generation. We in this room, some of you are part of the Apollo generation, but all of us in this room are part of the Artemis generation. Let's go make it happen. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you.